Margaret had always been the kind of woman who blended into crowds, who spoke softly and smiled politely when others filled the room with laughter. But lately, even those small social graces felt like too much effort. The divorce papers had been signed 3 months ago, her teenage daughter barely spoke to her anymore, and the job she'd held for 15 years had been restructured right out from under her. So when evening came, Margaret found herself driving to the empty parking lot behind St. Mary's Catholic Church. Not because she attended there, she hadn't set foot in any church since her mother's funeral 5 years earlier, but because it was quiet, hidden from the main street by a row of oak trees that seemed to understand the need for privacy. She would park her silver Honda Civic in the same spot every night, beneath the flickering streetlight that cast just enough glow to make her feel less alone in the darkness. The leather seats had molded to her body over the weeks, becoming as familiar as her own skin. This was where Margaret came to fall apart without judgment, where she could let the mask slip away and be honest about how scared she really was. The car had become Margaret's sanctuary, not by design, but by necessity. Churches felt too formal, too full of people who seemed to have their lives figured out. Her apartment echoed with the absence of her daughter's laughter and her ex-husband's morning coffee routine. Even the local park where she used to walk felt exposed, too open to curious neighbors who might ask how she was doing with that pitying look in their eyes. But here, in the driver's seat with the engine turned off and the radio silent, Margaret had found something she'd never experienced before, a place where she could be completely honest with God. The cracked dashboard became her altar, the steering wheel her place to rest her forehead when the sobs came too hard to contain. There was something about being enclosed, protected by metal and glass, that made her feel safe enough to voice the fears that kept her awake at night. The car didn't judge her for crying. It didn't offer empty platitudes about everything happening for a reason. It simply held her, night after night, as she poured out her heart to a God she wasn't even sure was listening. Rain or shine, snow or sweltering heat, Margaret returned to her spot at exactly 9:47 p.m. She tried other times, but somehow that specific moment after the dinner dishes were done, after the evening news had reminded her how broken the world was, after she de-checked her phone one more time, hoping for a text from Sarah that never came, felt right. Her prayers weren't the polished, memorized words she remembered from childhood Sunday school. They were raw, messy conversations that started with God, I don't even know if you're there, but ... and spiraled into desperate confessions about feeling like a failure as a mother, a wife, a human being. Please, she would whisper into the darkness, her breath fogging the windshield in winter, please show me that I matter, that my life has some purpose beyond just surviving until tomorrow. Some nights she asked for her daughter to forgive her for not being the mother she needed. Other nights she begged for the strength to face another day of job interviews and rejection emails. The words varied, but the ache remained constant, a hollow feeling that no amount of prayer seemed to fill. Mrs. Patterson, who lived in the house across from the church parking lot, was the first to notice the same car appearing every night. She mentioned it to her husband over breakfast, wondering if someone was having car trouble or perhaps meeting someone they shouldn't be meeting. Father Rodriguez, making his evening rounds to lock up the church, had seen the lone figure sitting in the silver Honda. He had approached once, tapping gently on the window to ask if everything was all right. Margaret had quickly wiped her eyes, rolled down the window just a crack, and assured him she was fine, just making some phone calls. The priest had nodded kindly and walked away, but she could see in his eyes that he knew she was hurting. Even Tom, the night security guard who patrolled the strip mall next door, had grown curious about the woman who arrived like clockwork and sat in her car for exactly 43 minutes before driving away. He'd considered calling the police, thinking maybe she was casing the church or waiting for some illegal transaction, but something about her posture shoulders slumped, Head often bowed suggested she was more broken than dangerous. One particularly cold February night, Mrs. Patterson finally acted on her concern. She bundled up in her winter coat and walked across the street, knocking softly on Margaret's passenger window. "Honey, are you okay? I see you out here every night, and I just want to make sure you're safe." Margaret had been so startled she'd nearly honked the horn. Through chattering teeth, she'd managed to say she was just taking some quiet time to think. Mrs. Patterson had studied her face in the streetlight, seeing the tear tracks and the exhaustion, and simply said, "Well, if you ever need a warm place to sit and think, my kitchen light's always on." Then she'd walked back to her house, leaving Margaret to wonder if God was already answering her prayers in ways too small to notice. March 15th started like any other day, gray skies, another rejection email, and Sarah returning her phone call only to ask when the child support check would arrive. Margaret had driven to her usual spot feeling more defeated than ever, convinced that her prayers were just words disappearing into an empty universe. She'd been sitting there for about 20 minutes, not even praying anymore, just staring at the dashboard and wondering if she should give up this nightly ritual that seemed to change nothing. The silence felt heavier than usual, pressing down on her chest until breathing became difficult. That's when she noticed the man walking across the parking lot. He was tall and lean, wearing a simple brown jacket, and he moved with the kind of unhurried pace that suggested he had nowhere important to be. What struck Margaret most was that he seemed to be walking directly toward her car, as if he'd been looking for her specifically. Her first instinct was fear. It was nearly 10:30 p.m., and she was alone in a dark parking lot. She reached for her keys, ready to start the engine and drive away, but something made her pause. The man's face, as he drew closer, wasn't threatening. If anything, he looked familiar, though she was certain they'd never met. He stopped about 10 feet from her car and simply stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at her through the windshield with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Margaret found herself unable to look away, unable to start the car, unable to do anything but sit there and wonder why she suddenly felt like crying not from sadness this time, but from something else entirely. The man approached her window slowly, and when Margaret rolled it down something she couldn't explain doing. Given her usual caution with strangers, he spoke in a voice that was gentle but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Margaret," he said, and hearing her name spoken by this stranger should have terrified her, but instead it felt like coming home. "You've been faithful in your prayers. Every night, sitting here, pouring out your heart. Did you think no one was listening?" Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came out. How did he know her name? How did he know about her prayers? She glanced around the empty parking lot, half expecting to see someone else who might have told this man about her nightly visits, but they were completely alone. "I don't understand," she finally managed to whisper. The man smiled, and it was the kind of smile that seemed to light up the darkness around them. "You ask to know that your life has purpose, that you matter. You beg to see that you're not forgotten." He paused, and Margaret felt as if the world had gone completely still. "Did you think your prayers were falling on deaf ears?" Margaret began to tremble, not from fear, but from a recognition that went deeper than logic. "I am the answer to your question," he said simply. "You asked if anyone was listening. You wondered if your pain mattered to anyone. You've been seen, Margaret. Every tear, every whispered prayer, every night you chose to come here instead of giving up entirely, it all matters." The tears came then, but they were different from the ones she'd shed so many nights before. These tears felt like relief, like a dam breaking after holding back a flood for too long. "Your daughter," the man continued, his voice cutting through Margaret's sobs, "calls you tomorrow at 2:17 p.m. She's been wanting to reach out for weeks, but pride and hurt have been holding her back. When she calls, don't let your own pride get in the way." Margaret wiped her eyes, trying to focus. How could you possibly know that? The job interview you have on Thursday, the one you almost canceled because you didn't think you requalified. The manager's name is David Chen, and he's going to ask you about a time when you had to start over. Tell him about these nights, Margaret. Tell him about choosing to hope when hope seemed impossible. The specificity of these predictions should have made Margaret skeptical, but instead she felt a deep certainty settling in her chest. This wasn't coincidence or lucky guessing. This was something far beyond her understanding. But why? She asked. Why me? I'm nobody special. I'm divorced, unemployed, and my own daughter barely speaks to me. What purpose could I possibly have? The man leaned closer to the window, and Margaret caught a scent like rain on warm earth, like the air after a cleansing storm. Margaret, you've been sitting in this parking lot for 3 months, faithful in prayer even when you saw no results. Do you know how rare that kind of faith is? How precious it is to find someone who keeps showing up, even when heaven seems silent? He gestured toward the houses surrounding the church. Mrs. Patterson has been praying for you every night since she first saw you here. Father Rodriguez includes you in his evening prayers, asking God to comfort the woman who seeks you in the darkness. Tom, the security guard, has been leaving bottles of water on your windshield on hot nights. Did you think those appeared by accident? Margaret's eyes widened. She had noticed the water bottles, had assumed they were left by maintenance crews or fellow night shift workers. I thought ... double quotes. You thought you were alone. But Margaret, you've been surrounded by love this entire time. Your faithfulness in this car, your refusal to give up even when everything felt hopeless. It's been an inspiration to everyone who has witnessed it. You just couldn't see it yet. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. These are copies of the prayers that have been said for you over the past 3 months. Would you like to hear some of them? Without waiting for an answer, he opened to a random page and began to read in Mrs. Patterson's voice. Dear Lord, please comfort the woman in the parking lot. She looks so lonely, and I know that feeling. Let her know she's seen and loved. He flipped to another page, and suddenly it was Father Rodriguez's gentle accent. God, the woman who comes to pray in her car shows more faith than many who fill our pews. Bless her perseverance and answer her cries. Another page, and Tom's gruff voice. I don't know how to pray fancy, but that lady out there is hurting bad. If you're real, maybe you could throw her a bone. She seems like good people. Margaret listened in amazement as the man read prayer after prayer, each one lifting her name. Somehow they all knew her name to God. Some were from people she'd never spoken to, neighbors who'd simply noticed her routine and felt moved to intercede. Others were from Sarah's teachers who'd been praying for their troubled student's family situation. Even her ex-husband's mother had been praying for Margaret's healing and new beginning. All this time, Margaret whispered, I thought God wasn't hearing me, but he was orchestrating an entire community to pray for me without me even knowing it. The man smiled and closed the notebook. Margaret, your prayers were never falling into a void. They were creating ripples that touch more lives than you can imagine. Your faithfulness in this car has been a testimony to the power of persistent prayer, especially when the answers seem delayed. He looked directly into her eyes, and Margaret felt as if she were being seen completely, flaws and all, and loved anyway. You asked for purpose. Your purpose has been demonstrated every single night for 3 months. You've shown a watching world what it looks like to seek God, desperately, honestly, and without giving up. The man began to walk away, but paused and turned back. Margaret, your story doesn't end in this car. It begins here. True to his words, Margaret's phone rang the next day at exactly 2:17 p.m. Sarah's voice was hesitant, almost shy. Mom? I was wondering, could we maybe talk? I mean, really talk? The job interview on Thursday went better than Margaret had dared to hope. When David Chen asked about a time she'd had to start over, Margaret found herself telling him about her nightly prayers in the church parking lot, about learning to hope when hope seemed impossible. Instead of looking at her strangely, David's eyes had filled with understanding. "My sister went through a similar time," he'd said quietly. "She used to drive to different parking lots just to have a safe place to fall apart. She said it saved her life." Margaret got the job, but the real ripple effects began when Margaret started noticing others. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that her grandson was struggling with depression, and Margaret found herself offering to pray with him. Father Rodriguez asked if she'd be willing to share her story with the church as support group for people going through divorce. Tom, the security guard, confided that he'd been thinking about starting to pray again after watching her faithfulness night after night. Within 6 months, Margaret's story had spread throughout the small community. People began referring to the church parking lot as prayer spot, and others started coming there for their own quiet time with God. A young mother dealing with postpartum depression, an elderly man grieving his wife's death, a teenager struggling with addiction. Margaret realized that her months of feeling forgotten and purposeless had actually been preparation for something much larger than her own healing. She'd been learning how to hope in the darkness. She could teach others to do the same. 6 months after that life-changing encounter, Margaret still went to the parking lot, but now she wasn't always alone. Sometimes Sarah joined her, working through her own relationship with faith and forgiveness. Sometimes it was Mrs. Patterson, who'd become like a second mother to her. Sometimes it was complete strangers who'd heard about the woman who found God in a Honda Civic and wondered if they might find him there too. The car that had once been a place of desperation had become something else entirely, a testament to the truth that God meets us wherever we are. Whenever we're ready to be honest about our need for him, Margaret kept a small journal now, recording not just her own prayers, but the stories of others who found their way to faith in unexpected places. A businessman who prayed in his office bathroom during lunch breaks. A nurse who talked to God during her 3 a.m. rounds. A college student who found peace while doing laundry in the dormitory basement. The location, Margaret had learned, was never the point. The point was showing up, being honest, and refusing to give up even when heaven seemed silent. Whether it was a church pew, a kitchen table, a hospital room, or the front seat of a 15-year-old Honda Civic, any place could become holy ground when it became a place of honest encounter with the divine. Margaret's story had started with one woman, one car, and one desperate prayer. Please show me that I matter. The answer, when it finally came, revealed that she'd mattered all along, not just to God, but to an entire community of people who been touched by her faithfulness when she thought no one was watching. Sometimes the most profound prayers aren't spoken in cathedrals or whispered in candlelit sanctuaries. Sometimes they recried out in parking lots by broken people who run out of anywhere else to go. And sometimes those are exactly the prayers that move heaven to action, creating ripples that change not just one life, but an entire community of lives that needed to witness what unwavering faith looks like in the darkness. Your secret place, wherever it is, can be holy ground. God is waiting to meet you there.